A large component of our journey as Christians is learning to give up our desires and following God's will for our lives. I want to take us to the story of Abraham. We all know Abraham's story. He waited basically an entire lifetime to have his first son, his one child that God had been promising him for so long. Now that alone in itself is incredible. How many of us are willing to wait an entire lifetime to walk into God's promise for us? I don't know about you, but for me waiting, I don't know how many years you waited. I think it was definitely like over 80, I think. Over 80 years waiting just to have your first son, and you're supposed to believe that your wife is basically barren and you can't see how that would happen. But you know, we're learning in our journey as Christians that we're supposed to trust God. Like God is the God of miracles, right? That's one thing. That's one component. That alone, Abraham showed incredible faith. Now imagine you've waited your whole lifetime for God to finally bless you with what you've wanted all your life. And then he decides, give it up for me. Would you? Because that's exactly what Abraham was willing to do. God called Abraham and said, I want you to sacrifice Isaac for me. Right? You love Isaac with all your heart, and it makes sense. You waited your whole life. I promised him to you. I've given him to you. Now, I want to test your faith. Go ahead. Go sacrifice him for me. That's heavy. Now, I know when we read the Bible, we read stories like that, and it's kind of just like, that's quite interesting. Abraham showed good faith, but put yourself in his position. Put yourself in his position. Your son, you've waited your whole life to have. God asks you to give him up. Sacrifice him to God. To sacrifice him. I don't know about you. I would really struggle with that. Right? But Abraham had the faith to do that. Now, I want to talk about a sermon I was listening to last week by Cliff Nettle. I don't know if you guys know him, but Cliff, he's incredible, right? He does those videos where he goes to student campuses and he debates atheists, basically. He debates atheists from a Christian standpoint, and it's incredible, right? But I was listening to one of his sermons because I feel like this guy is just very anointed, and I was listening to his sermons. I found his church that he preaches at. I forgot the name. I think I'm not going to remember it. But you can just search him up, honestly, if you want to listen to him. But his sermon I was listening to was called How God Calls Us. And the premise of this sermon, or one of the major talking points I took away from this, it's actually, he used the story, so that's exactly, I'm just relaying it to you in my own words, basically. But he said that the lesson in the story of Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac is that we should be willing to give up every source of significance and security in our lives for God. Now, again, that's a statement that it's not too controversial. It should not be controversial at all, right? Because God is Alpha and Omega. We should be willing to give up everything for him, right? But I want you to think about that statement, right? The lesson is that you should be willing to give up every source of significance and security for God. Now, I know for me, and for a lot of people out there, and it's probably including you, that's a very difficult thing to do. Our source of significance and security, as humans, we crave significance and security, right? And obviously, like I said at the start, our journey in Christ is this battle where we're wrestling with ourselves and God, right? We're wrestling. We who wrestle with God. To talk about Jordan Peterson's book, right? We're wrestling with us giving up our desires for God. And again, it shouldn't be too difficult, because God, he gives you everything, right? And that's the lesson here, right? Isaac was a gift from God, right? He was not just a gift, he was a miracle, a living, breathing miracle, right? And we think, I'm like, God, if you just do this for me in my life, I will have so much faith, right? But that faith is tested when once God gives you that, he asks you to give it up for him. Are you willing to give it up for him? Right? Going back to the Abraham story, Isaac was a miracle, right? A perfect gift from God. And God asked Abraham to give up Isaac for him, because he did not want us to put the gift above the giver, right? It's not a controversial statement. It makes perfect sense, right? We should not put the person who gives below what he has given us. But as humans, that's difficult. That's really, really difficult, and you need to have a shift in this mindset. Going back to what Cliff was saying in his sermon, tying it in together with the story of Abraham, right? You should be willing to give up every source of security and significance to God. Why? Because everything you have in your life, right? And again, like I said, I'm taking this straight from what I heard from Cliff, and I'm just paraphrasing. Everything you have in your life, your wealth, we all know about your wealth, your friendships, your health, right? Your knowledge, everything you have, everything you take pride in, your looks, I don't know what it is, right? Your following, whatever it is that you take pride in, that gives you that worth, that self-worth, everything can be taken away from you. Your life can be taken away from you. But the one thing that can never be taken away from you is God. No one can take God away from you. And that is what God is calling us to do. He's calling us to put Him above every other gift we've ever received from Him. And as I'm saying, this is basic. It's simple, right? It makes sense, right? You cannot put the gift above the giver. But when you try to live it out in your life, it's very, very difficult. It's difficult to be, again, just put yourself in Abraham's shoes. That is, I could not. I'm telling you right now, in the position I'm in now, telling you the story and how we should be giving up every source of significance to God, I would struggle. But you know, Abraham, when he was called, when God asked him, he did not, I don't think he put up a fight, right? But I know certainly the next morning, the very next morning, he was up. He was going up to the mountain as God told him. He went up, right? And if I had any chance of doing that, I would take some time. I would procrastinate. I would be like, I'd plead with God, right? Because that's what we do in prayer nowadays, right? What we get wrong in prayer is that we're kind of trying to change God's mind when prayer is meant to change our mind, right? I know I'd be doing that, bro. I would be probably like, God, please, something else, right? But that's the lesson there. God would be like, particularly that, because that is what you're making an idol. You're putting that above me, right? And it's quite interesting in the story, right? Because obviously Abraham had this incredible faith, showed incredible faith to give up the gift that God had given him, that he'd waited so long for, that he cherished with all his heart, right? He loved Isaac more than himself, as a father should, right? He was willing to give it up. It's incredible faith. But it's interesting when you realize where his faith lay, right? Obviously his faith lay in God. But it wasn't just like, oh, God is just testing me. He's not gonna actually make me kill Isaac. No, it wasn't that. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac because in his mind he believed that God could raise him from the dead. And even though he didn't understand why God was asking him to kill Isaac, right? He believed that in the end it would be fine. He believed that in the end he would have Isaac. Now, the way he believed it was that God would raise him from the dead, right? God was kind of just testing him to be like, I want to see if you will actually sacrifice Isaac for me. And Abraham was like, okay, I'll sacrifice him. But then I'm going to ask you, can you please raise him from the dead, right? And he had faith in that. He had faith in God's ability to raise Isaac from the dead. More faith in that than he did in following his own way. More faith in that if he listens to what God says, God would raise Isaac from the dead. More faith in that than he did in saying, I'm not going to sacrifice my son. Which is very difficult for a lot of us, right? And I'm just reminded a lot of James and Romans, because that's where I was reading James and Romans. I've been reading them a lot this year, because those books are incredible if you want to learn about your relationship with God. And James particularly, if you want to learn about faith and works. I normally used to say faith versus works, but it's not faith versus works. It's faith and works. They're interlinked, right? But if you want to learn about your relationship with God, how to get to heaven, Romans and James, incredible, right? Now in Romans and James, I think it's James who wrote James, and then it will be Paul who wrote Romans, right? They were saying that Abraham was counted as righteous because of his faith. Right? And again, this is tying in with what I'm saying about how James and Romans are about faith and works, right? A lot of people in this case would be like, nah, Abraham was counted righteous because of his works, right? He went there, God told him to sacrifice his son, and he went and he did it. But it was not, well, he actually didn't end up having to kill him, of course. Like God was like, okay, I've seen that you have faith. He wasn't counted righteous because he actually like was going to sacrifice Isaac because God told him to do that. He was counted righteous because he had faith in whatever it was that God had planned for him. He had faith in God more than he had faith in himself. And that's the kind of faith we need to have. Like, I want you to ask yourself, would you be able to have that kind of faith? I just want you to marinate, really just put yourself in the shoes and ask yourself, would you have that kind of faith? Now, speaking about faith, right? I know a difficulty we have, certainly for me, when I've been trying to build my relationship with God, right? Well, I've been building my relationship with God, is how do I balance that fine line between having faith that God will provide, but also knowing that my desires might not align with His will for my life. And again, I'm taken back to, I think it's either this same sermon from Cliff or a different one, but either way, very significant, right? And very, very important. This could actually be a whole other video. The Bible does not promise you any of these things. Like, it does not promise you a good house, it does not promise you a wife and family, right? It does not promise that you will be happy. It does not promise that you'll have an easy life. It does not promise that if you do this, if you follow my path, right, you will get all these nice things from the world. It does not promise that. What it does promise is that if you follow in God's will for you, you will be fine. You will be saved at the end, right? You will see heaven, and heaven is greater than anything we could ever imagine. That is promised. It is promised that if you follow in God's will, right, His will and purpose will be fulfilled through you, right? Again, it does not promise an easy life. Look at Jesus' life, right? It does not promise any of these things, right? And our faith, again, needs to be in the fact that we follow a great God, right? He's the Alpha and Omega, right? The beginning and the end. He created this universe, right? He created you from head to toe. Every perfect gift comes from above, right? Sorry, I got something in my eye. But yeah, everything comes from God. And the promise is that if you follow in God's will, His purpose will be fulfilled through you. Nothing more, right? There's nothing else. It's not, if you follow God's will, if you follow God, you're gonna have that wonderful family you've always wanted. I know in Psalm it says, I think it's Psalms where it says, follow God and He will grant you the desires of your heart. Now that's something that a lot of people sort of misread, right? Or Romans 8 verse 28, all things work together for the good of those who love Him. That's a perfect verse for this analogy, actually. All things work together for the good of those who love Him, right? People misinterpret that to say, okay, if I follow what God says, I'm going to get everything I want, right? Psalm says, follow God and He'll grant you the desires of your heart. But what they fail to understand is that if you truly follow God, if you have true, sincere faith, right, in God, you will have that Abrahamic, I don't know if that's an adjective I can use, Abrahamic faith, or the faith that Abraham had, where you will put God's purpose and God's will for your life above yours, right? That is truly following God. That is following God, and then He'll grant you the desires of your heart, right? That is all things work together for the good of those who love Him. If you love Him, right, and if you truly follow God, you're willing to put His will above all your desires, everything you want. And when that happens, your heart is changed, right? Your heart's desires change. Now, hopefully for us, obviously again, we shouldn't even be hoping for that. I was going to say we should be hoping that when we decide to follow God and we put Him above, we put His will above everything we want, hopefully He's still willing to, the desires we have then are still the same as the ones we have now. But it shouldn't be like that. We should be willing to say, I lay down everything that I desire, right? I lay down these desires that have been put in my head by the world. I lay them down. I'm fully focused on you, God. Whatever it is you want for me, I want it, right? Psalms, right? That is a incredible book by David, right? All the Psalms of David are incredible. But what was David, right? He was a man after God's own heart. And God blessed him with everything. But first, he had to be a man after God's own heart. Are you going to be a person after God's own heart? Are you going to be a man after God's own heart? Again, these are questions we have to sit with ourselves and really ask, because it's difficult. But pertaining to the title of this video, God's plan will work out for you, but you need to follow it. You need to have that faith that Abraham had, where you're willing to give up every good thing in your life, because that can be taken away from you. God cannot. Make sure you guys hit subscribe to join the Self-Improvement Brotherhood. Let me know what you think of the topic in the comment section below and how it applies to your life, and any stories you guys have actually to share in regards to this. But until next time, see you boys.